Up next is getting started with website accessibility. In 2017, there were 814 federal lawsuits related to website accessibility. In 2018, that number skyrocketed to 2,285, and in 2019, there were 2,235 cases. This begs the question for all website operators and owners: is your website and the content on it accessible to people of all abilities on all the devices? Are you meeting your legal requirements for web accessibility? This webinar will cover what web accessibility means, which organizations are legally required to have an accessible website, including a review of some recent legal cases, and how to identify and fix accessibility issues on your website. Additionally, we will discuss how to create a culture of accessibility at your organization and get buy-in and budgetary support for accessibility improvements. So I would like to introduce our speaker for this session, Creative Director and CEO at Equalize Digital, Amber Hines.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. Let's get my slides shared up here, and I'm ready to get started. Awesome. So if you want to reference these slides, I'm throwing up a link here, equalizedigital.com/slides. There you'll see, and I'll mention on a few of the slides where there are highlighted links that are clickable that go out to different resources. So you'll definitely want to grab a copy of the slides if you want to access those links. Real quick, I want to go over today's goals. The first is I want to make sure everybody has a clear understanding of what website accessibility means. I want to go over some of the current laws so that everyone has a feel for whether or not they might apply to your business or your nonprofit or your agency if you're working in government. And I want to go over how to identify common accessibility issues on websites, how to know and test your website for accessibility. Don't worry, this is not a developer-focused talk. We'll hit on a few things that are developer-focused or that you might need to know, but not because I'm hoping that you're going to go code something on your website, but because I really want to make sure that you have the language and the understanding to be able to talk to whoever your developer is. And then we'll talk about a lot of items that even non-technical content managers can do on their website to make them more accessible. And then finally, as mentioned in the great introduction, we'll be talking about different ideas for creating a culture of accessibility at your organization. So let's start with website accessibility, what it is. An accessible website is one that can be used by everyone, people of all abilities and disabilities. And what does that mean? I have on the slide here a giant tag cloud, if you will, or word cloud that shows a whole bunch of different types of impairments. So when we're talking about different levels of abilities, we're talking about anything from someone who is blind or let's say profoundly deaf to someone that may be getting older and they have cataracts and now they have a visual impairment that makes it harder for them to see lighter text or very small text, things like that. We're also talking about cognitive disabilities and impairments that can cause seizure disorders. We're talking about people who have physical limitations in one way or another, sometimes meaning they can't use a mouse, they can only use a keyboard. Sometimes they can't even use a keyboard. For example, people who are paraplegic and they use devices with straws that they blow into in order to navigate websites and type things out on a computer. So we're talking about a full range of different types of abilities. And with that, I think it's also important to be aware that this isn't just, we're not necessarily talking about people who were born with different abilities, but these are also situations that can come up. So for example, veterans sometimes have things that have happened to them in combat, which may cause them to have more challenges when navigating the web or using a computer. We're also talking about things related to age. A lot of these also can impact people if they're in a rural area or they're on a metered connection, like let's say they don't have Wi-Fi at home. So there can be both situational and one-time disabilities, like if you break your right hand and you can no longer use a mouse, but it's for a short time and then you're able to use it again. Or it can be a permanent difference in ability that is lifelong. So why does accessibility matter? I like to start with this business case because I think a lot of times, and we'll circle back to this, when we're talking to companies or people that work and they're like saying, you know, I understand why this is important, but how do I sell my CEO on it? Or how do I sell my board on this? And so this is sort of information that can be good, and we'll talk more about that in a little bit. So here's some background. Greater than 1 billion people in the world have a disability. That's about 15% of the world's population. Here in the United States, the CDC said in 2018 that 1 in 4 US adults have a disability. And the US Department of Labor estimates that over $200 billion per year in discretionary, so right, optional spending is spent annually in the United States by disabled persons. So that is a huge market that if you can reach them, they have discretionary spending that they could spend with your business or organization. And that was all before COVID. I have a chart up here that you can see. It's from Power Review's analysis of consumer activity from March 1st to April 20th online. And you can see there is a very large number that goes up, and it has a peak that says 210%. And that is the number of online orders and the increase in online e-commerce purchases. And then you can also see that there was a 63% increase in page visits, which is this number lower, the line lower down on the screen. And that really shows you not only did more people start going to websites because of COVID and everyone's having to stay home, but they also, there was a dramatic increase in actually making purchases. So we used to see people would do a lot of research and then they might still go into the store to make the purchase. But now we're seeing the increase in page visits and then a huge spike in actually making the purchase online. So 25% increase in e-commerce sales since the beginning of March. This number is from the summer. I haven't found an updated one, but this is like March to June. And a 62% increase in order online store pickup. This graph shows you, it's from Statista, and it shows the impact on the fastest growing categories in e-commerce since in the United States. So these are the sort of items that people are buying. If you have a CPG brand, this might be interesting to you to know like what is being bought online. So why do I bring up COVID and people online? The thing is more and more people are interacting with businesses online than they ever had before. And this isn't just e-commerce. This is also, now people are doing a lot more of ordering food online. So if you have a restaurant, they may be ordering food online. They are consuming a lot more digital media. So this really does apply to everyone. And I really like this quote from John Copeland, who's the Vice President of Marketing and Customer Insights at Adobe. He said that companies need to pay extra special attention to their digital and e-commerce experiences right now. Consumers are less forgiving during a time like this, and the companies that meet and exceed their needs will build loyalty and lifetime value. So this really speaks to why it's really important to reach everyone, not just the people that have what we think of as more typical abilities and are able to use websites in a more typical way. So accessibility matters because it's good karma. I always like to say, I like to start with that. And I really hope that's the reason, like everyone says, okay, I want to give everyone equal access to what I'm putting out on the web. But that said, there are other reasons why you might think about it as well. So accessibility is frequently good for SEO. Things that you do on your website to make it more accessible can help make it rank better in search engines. It increases revenue opportunities. That's that $200 billion that we talked about. And in some cases, it's legally required. So I'm going to talk about accessibility laws as I understand them. I'm going to talk about some cases. I have done a ton of reading and a lot of research, and I follow these things because this is what we specialize in. But I always have a little caveat, which is I'm not a lawyer. So I can answer some questions, but if you have specific legal questions or you're really not sure, then I always recommend reaching out to a lawyer that specializes in disability law. So why do we say that accessibility is legally required in the United States? The reason why is that accessibility has been determined historically through cases to be a civil right, which means we believe that all people should have equal access to some very specific information. That is things like education, transit information, voting, healthcare. We believe everyone should have equal access to employment. That's why we have a lot of the anti-discrimination laws that we have, any sort of human services. And this is where it also gets kind of murky, right? Because food, dining, those sorts of things could potentially be what we consider a vital service that someone needs. And so we're saying that all people should have equal access to that. Additionally, we believe in America that everyone should have equal ability to participate fully in our society. And that is why accessibility has become, was with the introduction of the Americans with Disabilities Act, has become part of why it matters for even businesses that don't necessarily say, I don't do voting, I don't do healthcare information. It's, again, trying to give people full access to participate in the society the same as everyone else. So here are some of the laws. The Rehabilitation Act of 1973, this has two sections, Section 504 and Section 508. Section 504 specifically says that no otherwise qualified individual can be excluded from participation of information or program or activity that is receiving federal financial assistance. So this most typically applies to government agencies, federally funded projects, K through 12 schools, post-secondary entities. Also, we see nonprofits. If you're receiving any sort of federal grants, then you typically have to follow Section 504 and Section 508. And Section 508 specifically bars the federal government from procuring electronic and information technology goods and services, which includes website design, that are not fully accessible to people with disabilities. So if you are in that group that receives any sort of federal funding, then these laws apply to you. What happens if a complaint arises and someone is in that group? So under the Rehabilitation Act of 1973, anyone who believes that they're being discriminated against or that a website is not accessible, and it should be, can file an administrative complaint with the agencies in charge of that website. They can file a private lawsuit in federal district court, or they can file a formal complaint with the U.S. DOJ Office of Civil Rights. So the next law that comes into play potentially for some businesses is the Telecommunications Act of 1996. So if you make telecommunications equipment or software, then you have to make sure that that equipment is designed, developed, and fabricated to be accessible to and usable by individuals with disabilities. The remedies under this is a complaint can be filed with the FCC. It does not allow lawsuits, and there's no provisions here for damages, so no one can sue you saying you're in violation of this act. However, they can file a complaint with the FCC, and then the FCC may take action if this applies to your organization. The biggest one, and we're going to spend a little bit talking about this, and the one you most commonly hear about that applies to websites and accessibilities is the Americans with Disabilities Act. There are two titles in this that apply. Title II says that communications with persons with disabilities must be, quote, as effective as communications with others. And then Title III deals specifically with the public accommodation of people with disabilities. And we're going to talk a little bit more about what that public accommodation means in just a minute. With the ADA, there are no clear laws on how the ADA applies to the web. There's no specific legal regulations that mention websites like we saw with, for example, Section 504 and Section 508. But there are increasing numbers of lawsuits filed and won under the ADA that have applied to websites. So while there's no law that specifically talks about accessibility, there's increasing case history that is beginning to show that website accessibility that websites have to be accessible under the ADA, just like your physical building might have to be. If it had stairs, it needs a wheelchair ramp, those sorts of things. So this is, we heard some of those numbers before, what the case looks like as far as the number of cases that have been filed. My understanding is that we're expecting the number in 2020 to be lower, but it's not necessarily because there's fewer website accessibility lawsuits happening. It's more that a lot of legal things are moving a lot slower right now. So they're thinking that the full number is going to be lower in 2020, and then it will probably go back up in 2021. So let's talk a little bit more about ADA lawsuits and what's out there. A lot of the noteworthy ones have been fast food, grocery stores. There's been a lot against Amazon and other large e-commerce or direct-to-consumer brands. So if you have a company that either sells online or sends things to people but don't have a physical store, then that could still apply to you as well. The most noteworthy one, and if you follow website accessibility at all, you might be aware of Dominos v. Robbins, which went to the Supreme Court at the end of 2019, so last year, about a year ago. Dominos was sued because they had something on their website that did not allow people using a person using a screen reader, which is an assistive technology device, if you are blind or visually impaired. He could not order pizza on their website. They said, well, we've got a phone number, but the thing is that's not separate. It's sort of like separate is not equal. And if sighted people can order a pizza on your website, then non-sighted people should also be able to order a pizza on your website. So federal courts ruled against Domino's, stating that Domino's did have to have an accessible website under the ADA laws. Domino's petitioned to the Supreme Court. They appealed, and they wanted the Supreme Court to weigh in. And in October of last year, the Supreme Court said, nope, we're not going to weigh in on this. The lower court's decision stands. So essentially that was considered a win for accessibility advocates who are trying to make sure that all websites are accessible. Winn-Dixie is an important case because this is one of the first cases that said websites are a public space. You remember under Title III, I said it relates to public accommodation of people in public spaces. And essentially, originally it was thought, well, a website isn't a public space. Winn-Dixie was sued in 2016 because their website wasn't accessible to blind people via screen readers. This case, they lost, and it was the first case to establish precedent that websites are held to the same standards as physical locations relating to the ADA. Websites are a public space. Winn-Dixie had to set aside $250,000 to fix their website. Blue Apron is a case that's pretty notable. As I mentioned previously, they don't have a physical store. You go to their website, you order, they send you a box, that sort of thing. And so they tried to say, we don't have a physical store, and therefore we shouldn't be required to follow ADA like a business that has a physical location that people can go to. And the district court in New Hampshire said, no, we're not going to dismiss this. This case is still pending. It hasn't resolved, but the fact that they didn't dismiss it is meaningful because they're saying, no, this case should move forward and they should be allowed to sue you because even though you don't have a physical store, your website is, again, it's a public space. Another big one that sort of wrapped up at the end of last year was both Harvard and MIT were being sued by the National Association of the Deaf for their captions on YouTube. So they had a lot of videos that they had either not put captions on at all, or they had used YouTube's auto-generated captions, which I've heard some deaf people call auto-craptions, because they just really don't do a good job of automatically figuring out what all the words are and accurately lining them up with speech in a way that is understandable for people who are hard of hearing. So they were accused of failing to make their open online courses and video content accessible to people who were deaf. They did end up losing, and they have to go back, and I think in some instances they've removed videos, and in other instances they're going and they are recaptioning them all at once. So this isn't just about your website. This is also related to the content that you put on a social media site as well. And then another thing that is really important to be aware of is that a lot of the accessibility lawsuits are not just about public schools, or sorry, they're not just about websites for the public. They're also about websites or software that is used by employees. So there have been ADA accessibility lawsuits for employees suing their employer because either the software or the website for that employer was not accessible to them. Finally, besides federal laws, you also need to think about any sort of state laws that may exist in your state. Here in Texas, we don't have a lot, but another thing that people increasingly were seeing come up is that because your website is outside, right, it's not limited to only people in Texas. If you do business in a state, for example, I just saw a case that was in California. The business was an e-commerce business in North Carolina, I believe, and they sent a good number of products to California and had California customers, and they got sued in the state of California for not having an accessible website. And states are the ones who decide whether or not damages are allowed for ADA cases, and California, Florida, and New York are the states where they allow the most amount of money in damages typically. And so they got sued even though they don't have a physical presence in California, but a good amount of the products they were shipping was going to California. So they were able to say, no, you are a business in this state and you're doing business here. Your website has to meet ADA, and they got sued in that state. So that's another thing you have to think about. It's not just Texas. You need to now think about the entire United States. And beyond that, you may even need to think about EU laws or laws in different Asian countries or in Latin America if you do business in those areas as well. So let's talk briefly about best practices. So your website should be, we use this acronym of POUR, which stands for Perceivable, Operable, Understandable, and Robust. What does that mean? Perceivable means information needs to be transformable from one form to another. It means that if someone is not sighted, then they should be able to hear an alternative text, for example, on an image. If they are not able to hear, then like we talked about with videos, there should be captions so they can read, or there should be a transcript for the video so they can then read what they could not hear. If someone is not able to use a mouse, it should still be operable via a keyboard. So it's very important that all of the information you have on your website can be transformed from one form to another so that it works for everyone. Additionally, your main content and message has to be separated from the way it is styled or presented. So if you're a developer, you know what CSS code is. That's code that styles the website and actually makes it look really pretty and nice. Some people with assistive technologies turn that off completely. So if you're using CSS code or certain JavaScript implementations in order to add in content, and they are blocking that because it makes it really hard for them to interact with websites when it's on, then they are going to miss out on that content. So you really have to make sure that everything is perceivable no matter how it is being viewed. Operable means, at its basics, not everyone uses a standard keyboard and mouse to navigate the web. So I've mentioned some other examples already, but basically you need to make sure your website has multiple ways to interact with it. There need to be user controls over time limits, timing. So if you have a slider on your site, they should be able to stop it. They should be able to advance it or go back if it's moving too fast. You need to make sure that you have clear instructions on your site. This is especially important if you have an e-commerce store or if you have a contact form on your website. It needs to be really clear what people are supposed to do in order to fill it out. And then if there's an error, so if I forget to put .com on the end of my email address and it's not a valid email address, we need to make sure that when that form submits, it very clearly explains what the error was, why it wasn't able to submit, and how I can fix it so that I can go and correct that and then submit the form. And then understandable. One of the items here is it has to do with being appropriately targeted language and reading level. So you want to make sure, ideally, we look at like 8th or 9th grade as being the ideal reading level for the general population. If you have more advanced reading level in your content, that may be fine, especially if that's who your target demographic is. However, if you wanted to meet the most strict guidelines for accessibility, then you would want to provide what's called a simplified summary that is at 8th grade or lower reading level in order to make sure that someone who might not be able to easily understand the higher reading level can then understand what the page is about. You want to make sure that any supplemental information, so for example, graphics, videos, have additional information. So if you have a graph on a page, you want to describe it, you want to explain what it is so that if that image doesn't load or someone can't see it, they can still get the data. You notice when I talked about the graph, I said there's a line that's up at the top, it has this percent, and then there's a second line that's lower down, it has this percent, and I verbally spoke it. You can write those sorts of things out that will explain what the important information from the graph is. Then you want to make sure, we talked a little bit about the having summaries or excerpts. That can be helpful before long articles, even if there is the appropriate reading level. And then you want to make sure that your functionality is understandable. So navigation structure, form interactions, having available tooltips, all of these things, making sure that it's consistent and that it's not tricky or it's sort of obvious about how to get around the website, how to do what you're supposed to do. Robust is the final element, and that relates to having functionality that works across current and ideally future devices. Sometimes it's hard to plan for future technology, but as much as possible, future devices, operating systems, and browsers. But for sure, you want current. You may also need to make sure that you're providing support for outdated versions. There are a lot of users of assistive technologies that do not run current versions of browsers, as well as a lot of older people. I still sometimes have people say, a lot of our customers use Internet Explorer. Internet Explorer reached end of life, I don't know, like 5 or 6 years ago, right? But so you need to make sure that your website can work on those, or if not, that you're providing them, some way, that you're providing them some sort of guidance on why this particular element might not work and how to get around it, or how to make that information available to them, even if it's not working in that particular browser or on that device. But ideally, you really do want to support some outdated versions. And then you want to make sure that you're validating against any technical standards for that platform, which tends to be something more that your developer would do for you. So what is your checklist? I always like to start this. When should you start thinking about accessibility? Pretty much the whole way through. So you want to ideally start at the beginning with your design. You want to think about it in coding. You want to think about it in your marketing. So like we talked about the videos needing captioning on YouTube, you want to think about it throughout the entire project. WebAIM is an organization that puts out a ton of information on accessibility. They did a study where they looked at the top 1 million websites, so like Facebook, Amazon, the websites that get the most traffic, and they looked at what their accessibility were. This graph shows you the percentage of pages that had the most common and with the most common errors. So they found 85% of the websites they studied had low contrast in colors. 68% were missing an alt text on an image. We'll talk more about these in a minute. 58% had empty links. 53% had missing labels. 33% were missing a language declaration. So nowhere in the code did it say this website is in English or this is in Spanish, which is important for someone on a screen reader. It needs to say what that is. They had buttons that they could tell it was a button, but there wasn't anything actually inside the button. So a screen reader would just say button, but they wouldn't know what it did or where it went. So we're going to talk about content and then design and development. These first slides are things that you can fix right now if you are a content manager on your website. Pretty much any content management system that's out there, whether it's WordPress, Squarespace, Shopify, whatever that is, would allow you to control these things without being a developer. So first, don't add text as images. I see this a lot of times where someone says, I made these cool header graphics and I put it at an angle, and instead of writing my heading or the title of my page as this is about us, I have an about us image that has the word about us and I'm inserting it in. Don't do that. That's very bad. You want to make sure that all of your images are actual images or potentially graphs or something like that. But don't just use an image or PNG or JPEG of text. If you have text, you should type it out using the actual text paragraph or heading tags that are in your content management system. Another item we talked about is captioning videos. If you have videos, ideally you also want to provide transcripts. This also applies to audio. So if you have a podcast, for example, for your business, you would want to provide transcripts for that podcast. We talked a little bit about reading level, so checking that. Avoid rapid flashing, no more than 3 times per second. This recommendation exists because people with seizure disorders can have seizures if you have something that is changing too quickly on your screen. It can literally cause them to have a seizure while they are viewing it. So you really want to make sure if you have a slider or something that autoplays that it is not flashing more than 3 times per second. You want to add controls that allow people to stop, pause videos and sliders. This is one of the biggest mistakes I see, and we saw color contrast and then we saw missing alt tags. So I have a screenshot up here that shows you where in the WordPress content management system you can add an alternative text for your image. But basically you need to have something that if someone cannot see this image, that it tells them what this image is about. So for example, this shows the Haynes Bay fish hook remover product, and you would want something that literally says, you know, fish hook remover tool on a white background might be enough. Or you could be more descriptive and you could talk about, you know, the fish hook remover, which has a long nose so that it can go into the fish's mouth, and a trigger that can be squeezed. Like, describe what it is, because if you're thinking, if a visually impaired person doesn't see this image and they might want to buy the product, this might be an opportunity for you to describe what the product looks like, and that might help them decide to purchase this product. Another big thing that we see all the time is what we call ambiguous anchor link text. So that's when you link text that's not the actual URL. And we see this a lot where people say, click here, read more details, buy now. So you really want to make sure that these actually are explicit, because if you have multiple click here, or even if you just have one click here on your website, someone with a screen reader, they sometimes will just go to all the links and they will hear a list of links on the page, particularly if they're trying to find something, and it would just say to them, click here. But they won't have the context of earlier in the sentence you said to contact us, right? So they just hear click here and they're like, why would I don't know what that is. I don't know where it's going to go. I'm not sure if I should click that. So what you, instead of saying to contact us, click here, you need to say contact us here, for example, and then you could link that whole thing, or you could just link the words contact us, or you could link the whole sentence to contact us, click here. So you really want to make sure that you are using really clear links. If you have buttons that do the read more or the buy now, if you're in WordPress, for example, most theme developers these days are appending, hopefully, screen reader text that adds like, so buy now, and then it would put fish hook remover as the product name. So someone would know if they were looking at an archive page with a bunch of different products, buy now for this product, buy now for that product. Otherwise, you really want to, if that's not automatically being appended with your theme, then you'd want to look into other themes or have a developer fix your theme to do that. And it's something that won't be visible to you, but if you were to inspect, or you'd have someone who knows how to inspect, they could tell you whether or not it was there. And then the design. So one of the items that we talked about was color contrast. Color contrast really gets to how much difference there is between the background color and the foreground color, and its readability. This is really important, especially as people get older, can cause issues. So there are color contrast checkers. You can Google that and you can find them and it will tell you. We'll also look at a tool in just a minute that checks for color contrast. You want to beware of line length issues. So not having your content go really wide. You should probably have a maximum width on it. We typically like to say if it's paragraph text that's kind of small, don't be too much wider than 700 or 750 pixels wide. If you're in a CMS where you're using a page builder and you're dragging and dropping things, it's really easy, especially if you're doing it on a laptop, to not really realize, oh, I set this to 100% width. But then if somebody puts it on a big monitor, like I have a big 4K monitor right now, and it's going to just go all the way to the whole side, it's really hard to read. Keeping related items close to one another. This is a good example of this is if you have a form where there are, you have a name, let's say to the left of the field where they would put their name, first name, and then the field. And this is the same thing. You want to make sure that they connect, because if you get wider on the screen and you don't have good styles for that, then they might move apart. And if there's a bunch of them, it's hard for people to track with their eyes across. Is this the field I'm supposed to fill out? So you need to make sure that you have those things with good proximity. And then we need to design focus states. So for links, buttons, anything like that, which allows someone when they're using a tab key to move through the website to see where their key and their focus is currently hovered. We'll look at an example of that in just a minute. And then we talked a little bit about designing for error states previously. I'm not going to go too much into development because I'm not sure how many developers we have, but I talked briefly about hiding informative text with screen readers. What's really important is using proper semantics. So if something is a heading, you should use a heading tag, and this may also apply to in your content management system. You want to make sure that you're using the proper headings in the proper order. So you have an H1 on the page, and then you might have a heading 2, and that has some title, and then you might have a couple heading 3s under it, and then you have another heading 2. You want to think about it like outline format. I've seen where people said, oh, I just used the H4 because it was smaller and I liked it. I thought it looked better, or it was a different color. And you really can't, you need to follow them in the proper order. So if you don't like the way if your H2 is too big, then you need to have that fixed in your theme styles rather than just using a different heading, for example. And then for developers, you always want to make sure you're mobile first, responsive design, and clearly navigable with a keyboard. So how do you test your website? I'm going to actually pull up an example real quick and show you. I love Tillamook. I love their ice cream. And they actually recently, I think, have been working on this site. I always feel a little bad. I'm like, I don't want to call it somebody, but I think they're an awesome company that needs a little bit of work. I have a free tool called Wave installed. There's a link in my slides to get this. There's a Chrome extension, or you can go to that website. But I just use this Chrome extension, and I am on any page of any website, and I can click that button, and it opens up this panel on the left, and it shows me, here's the number of errors I have, here's the contrast errors, and different sorts of items. If I go to the Details tab, I can then see, oh, missing alternative text. Now, if I click this, sometimes it goes to it, sometimes it doesn't. So if you are familiar with code, you can click on the code tab and it will click it and it highlights it there for me. And I can see image, oh, this has a class of header logo. So that's probably up in their header somewhere. It might actually be this giant logo that looks really big in Wave right now, is missing in alt tags. So that doesn't say like Tillamook logo. So that's a problem. And the low contrast, you can sort of see it will, let me close out the code. Missing form labels. So for example, right here, they're using placeholder text, subscribe to the newsletter. They don't have anything that says email address, which is what they would really need in order for this to be accessible for someone to know, what am I supposed to put in this field? So this is an accessibility problem. So this tool is really useful. It's free. Anyone can use it, and it will allow you to run through and get a good feel. Let's see. There's a lot more as far as different sort of testing resources that I have here. We're running short on time, so I'm not going to talk about all of them, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about them. I want to briefly touch on creating a culture of accessibility, and then I might have time for a question or two. So if you want to sell accessibility, I always say lead with data, show, don't tell. So some of those numbers we talked about, if you can say specifically for your organization what the potential bottom line impact is, you can share any legal realities. So this is what the lawsuits look like. Oh, here's a business that was just like ours that got sued under the ADA. So try and make a business case. And then another item is knowing your organization. So connect accessibility with your mission if you can. Show that how it will bring value to your organization, and then present accessibility at the right time. So obviously we think any time is the right time, but realistically, if you're saying, okay, I know that an audit is going to cost us this much money and we might need to redo our website, like present that at a time when you know your organization is building their budget, not at a time when they don't have their budget, or where it's already set in stone and it's not, there's no extra dollars for that. And then put a face on it. If you can, show real people who benefit. You want to do any sort of user testing is great. See if you can find real world customers that your board or your CEO would recognize to use as an examples. And then I always like to highlight that accessibility is everyone's job. It takes leadership from the top and responsibility from the bottom. So you really need to figure out how can this be core to your organization. You want to have an accessibility statement that is shared with your employees and the public. You should ideally designate an accessibility champion, plan regular trainings and updates. Make sure that you include everyone in all efforts and create a plan for escalating. So if you have a receptionist who answers the phone and someone calls and says, I was on your website and I was trying to use a screen reader and I can't get this information, in a lot of instances, the receptionist might say, oh, I'll give you the information, and that will be it. But she needs to be aware, or he needs to be aware that they need to then go to someone and say, someone called about our website, they were on this page, this is the specific problem that they had. So you need to have a plan in there. And then ideally, you want to build a diverse and inclusive team. So you're going to get the most information, and you want to get the most information out to everyone, and you're going to do the best as far as building accessibility in if you have a variety of perspectives on your team. And remember, it's okay to start small. Accessibility doesn't happen overnight, so even small incremental changes can make a difference. You may not have the ability to overhaul your website, but you could probably go there right now and make all those click here links, not just say click here, right? So there are small things that you can do that can make a big impact, and if you do it over time incrementally, it will get you there. So I have a ton of accessibility statement examples in the slides if you go grab them at that equalizedigital.com/slides. And I'm happy to answer a question if we've got a minute or two. I'm not sure. James, are you going to read these to me? Let's see. Okay, I see one that says, I noticed you used a dark background with light colored font. Is that recommended? Are there general tips that we can use for creating social media posts? So actually there is a lot of research that shows that the dark background with light colored font is actually easier on people's eyes. For people with certain like brain disorders or things like that. People who get migraines, for example, frequently can have a hard time with the darker text on a white background. So that is why I did that. I would say as far as social media graphics, I would definitely look at contrast. That's a huge item. that I would look at and make sure you're doing that, and font size. So I'm not, do we have time for more questions, or are we at time?
I believe we're at time.
Okay. Feel free to reach out to me, and I would answer all of these. Can you send them to me, James, so I could like post them up somewhere? Is that possible?
Sure.
Or, yeah. All right. Awesome.
Okay, well, I believe we're going to move on to our next session now. That was Amber Hines, the creative director and CEO at Equalize Digital. Thank you so much, Amber, for that great session. I learned a great deal about what it means to have an accessible website, as well as the legislation that dictates those standards. As you showed, the massive growth in e-commerce in the last 7 months has brought the need for meeting accessibility standards to its zenith. Equal ability to fully participate in our society is such an important paradigm for us as developers and designers to strive for. Thank you so much for giving your time, preferring great tips for content curation, and for teaching us about the reasoning behind website accessibility standards. Up next, we will transition to our networking session for this track. To network with other attendees, press the networking icon on the left-hand side of your screen. You will be randomly paired with another attendee and will have 5 minutes to chat with one another. If you'd like to connect your conversation after your session, click the connect button at the bottom of your screen, and you will both receive an email from Hopin that will help you contact one another later.